In his essay, Notes on the Auteur Theory in 1962, Andrew Sarris said that an auteur, one of the things they had to do was to have a distinguishable personality. And by that, he meant that they need to have recurring characteristics that you can see over their body of work. And there are lots of things that Tarantino is known for doing, and I'm going to talk about those things now and how we can see them in Pulp Fiction and across the rest of his films as well. So to begin with, I'm going to talk about one which maybe isn't quite so easy to place your finger on, but that's the aesthetic of his films. And if you were going to describe the aesthetic of his films in one word, I would probably say the word cool.
What?
Cool.
Correctamundo.
So everything about the aesthetic of the film is designed to look and feel cool, particularly the characters, the way that they dress, the way that they speak.
Royale with cheese.
Royale with cheese.
That's right.
Zed's dead, baby. Zed's dead.
You ain't got no problem, Jules. I'm on the motherfucker. Go back in there and chill them niggas out. And wait for the wolf, who should be coming directly.
The music that we hear in the film is also very cool sounding, and again, that makes the characters in the films look cool.
Let's go.
They even have cool wallets.
That's it. That's my bad motherfucker.
And I think this appearance of cool is something that Tarantino has really mastered very early on in his career. And he has this very good eye for the surface look of his films, and that's something that a lot of people have criticised him for, and they might say, yeah, his films look really cool and they sound really cool, but is there anything underneath all that sort of gloss and sheen? Are they just all surface level but no substance? Now, if we're looking at postmodernism, that is one of the key features of postmodernism, is that style and no substance is perfectly fine, because to kind of look for substance, to look for meaning, is more of a modernist way of looking at things. Another big part of the aesthetic of Quentin Tarantino's films, and certainly a recurring characteristic across his work, is very graphic violence.
I'm a cheerleader towards violence in cinema. You know, I have no problem with saying that I like violent movies and I respond to violent movies, and I actually think violence is one of the things that the Lumiere brothers helped invent the camera to do. It's actually, in some ways, it's cinema reaching its one of its fullest potentials.
And so the violence in a lot of his films is quite shocking and very gruesome. He doesn't spare the blood when he is shooting his movies. Particularly, I think when you look at the finale of a lot of his films, there are these explosions of blood everywhere in a really, really quite over the top and ridiculous in a lot of ways. Which for many viewers is perhaps a bit too much to take in. And incidentally, when you look at Pulp Fiction compared to other films like, say, Django Unchained or Kill Bill, it's quite muted in its use of violence, but nevertheless, when there is violence in there, I think it is still quite shocking and quite gruesome, especially by, you know, the standards of the time that it was made. And you might be thinking, well, sort of shocking and gruesome violence, is that something that is so unusual? Quite a lot of directors do that, and you might be right. If we think about other films that we study on the spec, like Pan's Labyrinth, there is in particular one incident of violence in that film which is really shocking and really gruesome, very hard to watch. But whereas violence in a film like that might be difficult for the viewer to watch, in a Quentin Tarantino film, we're encouraged to enjoy that violence. We're encouraged to think that it's fun, and to go back to the aesthetic thing, to think of it as cool.
Why the need for so much gruesome, graphic violence? Why not let us imagine
Because it's so much fun, Jan. Get it?
So sometimes the violence can be humorous. I've watched Pulp Fiction now with many a class, and very often the scene where Marvin gets his head shot off and John Travolta says the line,
Oh man, I shot Marvin in the face.
more often than than not, I'll always get a couple of students, if not the whole class, laughing at that line. And there's a lot of blood in that scene, but it's something that always manages to raise a chuckle. So that, I think, is very different compared to how most other directors use violence. And if the violence is done in a humorous way, that's normally because of the character's nonchalant reaction to it. And again, so Vincent's reaction to Marvin's death is quite nonchalant, as is the way that Jules kills a flock of seagulls in the apartment. He does it in a very sort of nonchalant way.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did I break your concentration? I didn't mean to do that. Please, continue.
On the flip side of that, we've got violence which is very cathartic, and this comes down to one of the major themes in Quentin Tarantino's films, and that is of revenge. So the film Kill Bill is just an out-and-out revenge film. Also in Inglourious Basterds, we've got the Jewish soldiers getting revenge against Nazis, and in Django Unchained, we've got a former slave getting revenge against white slave masters.
I like the way you beg, boy. Remember me? The way you die, boy.
This is something that he carries on through his work, and when we do see the violence in those films, so in particular let's think about Django Unchained, when we see Django whipping to death the Brittle brothers and shooting them, it is such a cathartic fist in the air moment where we are encouraged to enjoy the violence that's being inflicted against these oppressors. And we can definitely see that in Pulp Fiction as well, where Marcellus gets revenge against Zed and Butch kills Maynard. And in that moment, we're not supposed to be disgusted or shocked by the violence. We might be shocked by it, but we're meant to enjoy it. We're supposed to be really, really happy that Marcellus is now going to spend time torturing Zed.
You hear me talking, hillbilly boy? I ain't through with you by damn sight. I'ma get medieval on your ass.
And I think we can link that back to Tarantino's enjoyment of violent movies from a very young age.
I saw movies when I was a kid, all right? I saw all the movies that I'm basing my movies on are the movies I saw as a kid, and yes, kids go to a movie theater, they can tell the difference. Maybe you couldn't when you were a kid, but I could.
So he was watching films, exploitation movies, which have lots of violence in them from the age of a child. So he has this kind of childlike, gleeful approach to violence in his movies. And he's also very aware that what we're watching isn't real life, it's a movie.
But see, Jan, you're all messed up because you're talking about real life.
Oh,
and I'm talking about the movies. You gotta get it straight. Now, if you want to talk about the movies, we'll talk about the movies.
Okay, and
if you want
kids
to talk
at
about real
12
life,
can
we'll
tell
talk
the
about real
difference.
life.
And this is very sort of postmodern way of looking at violence in films, and it links back to one of Quentin Tarantino's cinematic heroes, Jean-Luc Godard, who, when questioned about the violence and the use of blood in his movies, said, "It's not blood, it's red. What we're seeing in this movie isn't real blood, it's just liquid dyed to look like blood." And Tarantino is telling us that it's okay to enjoy violence in these movies because it's a film. These are actors, this is just makeup. You don't have to feel guilty about it. You don't have to worry that if you watch this film, you're going to go out and be an incredibly violent person. Just enjoy it in the same way that you would do a comedy, or in the same way that you would enjoy a cathartic release of something like perhaps watching a sports game or something. And again, that kind of lack of guilt attached to enjoying violence is very postmodern. We're not supposed to be looking at things at this deeper level and going, oh, what is the significance of the violence in these films? We can just enjoy it on that visceral thrill level that Tarantino is encouraging us to do. Tarantino is often known for casting stars of the yesteryear, bygone stars if you want, or if you were going to be really cruel about it, maybe call them has-beens. This we can see in Pulp Fiction. So John Travolta was a big star back in the 70s. He starred in Grease, obviously it's one of his biggest films, but also Saturday Night Fever. By the time the 90s came around, John Travolta wasn't really getting cast in major roles anymore, but Tarantino wanted to cast John Travolta, and I think that's possibly because of one of his favourite films is Blowout, by one of his favourite directors, Brian De Palma, and that stars John Travolta. Travolta is also in Carrie, another Brian De Palma film as well. So this is something where we see his personal taste influence in the movie, and it isn't just in Pulp Fiction that we see this happen. He cast Pam Grier in Jackie Brown, who we love from the blaxploitation movies, Foxy Brown and Coffee. We also see him cast in martial arts stars like Sonny Chiba in Kill Bill.
Who's Sonny Chiba?
Who is Sonny Chiba? He's bar none the finest actor working in martial arts movies today.
And David Carradine, also in Kill Bill.
You know, like Kane in Kung Fu. Walk from place to place, meet people, get in adventures.
So this is something that he does very, very often in his films. Tarantino is often referred to as a postmodern director, and Pulp Fiction, one of the films that epitomizes postmodernism. And that is due to a couple of factors, but one of those is the film's use and Tarantino's use of intertextuality in his films. And intertextuality is a big feature of postmodern text. Postmodernism suggests that there are no new ideas, all you can do is just reuse what's gone before. And we see that in rap music, for example, which samples old songs, and Quentin Tarantino is sampling old films.
I've always aligned myself with that hip-hop idea of taking things that already exist and riffing on them, and by the way I put them together and expand on them, I create something new. That there's a jumping off point there, there's a lot of respect for what's there, but now something new exists.
Very often when we watch a Quentin Tarantino film, there are intertextual nods to other films or TV shows throughout it, and when we recognise them, we are being kind of let in on the club that he's inviting us into. He's saying, if you get this reference, come in, now you're part of my sort of world that I've created for you. And so whilst perhaps a meta en scène might lack originality because they might just be retreading and doing what other filmmakers and other films have done, Tarantino is using that lack of originality and turning it into a virtue. He is celebrating it in a very postmodern way. So whilst we might see films that are quite derivative and they don't get recognised and celebrated much as Pulp Fiction does, it's because they try to hide the fact that they are perhaps not that original, whereas Tarantino draws attention to it. He says, look, I'm ripping off this bit from this Sonny Chiba film.
The path of the righteous man and defender is beset on all sides by the inequity of selfish and the tyranny of evil men.
Blessed is he who in the name of charity and goodwill shepherds the weak through the valley of darkness.
For he is truly his brother's keeper and the father of lost children. And I will execute great vengeance upon them with furious anger.
Those who attempt to poison and destroy my brothers. And you will know my name is the Lord.
And they shall know that I am Chiba, the bodyguard, when I shall lay
my vengeance upon thee.
I'm ripping off this bit from Kiss Me Deadly, I'm ripping off this bit from Psycho. Here's that famous moment from The 7-Year Itch where Marilyn Monroe stands above the event. And so not only is he being so brazen, open and honest about the fact that yes, I am ripping off all of these films, there are a couple of things I think that are interesting about the films that he's ripping off and also the way that he does it. So firstly, it's that he rips off films that perhaps people might not have heard of, and this is kind of his love of obscure things and bringing them to the attention of a mainstream audience in the same way that he does with music. So he will say, this actor or this film or this scene, you haven't heard of it, but I'm going to put it in my film and you're now going to see it, and then people will go and check those things out as a result. So it tends to be obscure stuff, which I think is why he gets sort of recognised as maybe more of an artist than somebody who is ripping off mainstream popular stuff. And not only that, he's ripping it off from lots of disparate sources and putting them all together in one film. And when you sometimes try and combine all of these things, when you try and take a scene from a French New Wave film and a scene from a martial arts movie, a scene from a classical Hollywood film, and you put them together, it might not work, it could be an absolute mess, but actually in Pulp Fiction and in other Tarantino films, he does tend to pull off that bricolage effect quite well.
This is a tasty burger.
Another postmodern feature of Pulp Fiction and of Tarantino's work as an auteur is that lots of his films are self-reflexive. They remind you that whilst you're watching the film, that you are watching a film. You aren't watching real life. And this is why he kind of maybe gets away with the violence in his movies, because we know that what we're watching isn't really happening, it's just a film. And so the way that he does that is through his use of excessive style, that cool aesthetic that I mentioned, the over-the-topness of the violence in his movies, the nods to other films through intertextual references, the nods to other genres throughout the films where, you know, again, he's showing his knowledge of cinema and basically saying, you know, aren't I a clever boy? I know all of these genres, I know all of these films. There's also very self-conscious use of film form that draws attention to itself. So the editing early on in the film where we see Jules and Vincent shooting Brett and we cut between them and there's that golden glow in the corner of the screen which really brings attention to itself. We have moments where Mia Wallace draws a square and a dotted line appears on the screen. We've got the use of title cards, unusual camera placement where the camera is behind Jules and Vincent as they wait to go in there and we just stood there for a long time looking at the back of their heads. There's also the use of contrapuntal music which he's done in other films like Reservoir Dogs. Here I am, stuck in a pool with you. Yes, I'm stuck in and I'm warm.
Think you're gonna find when all this shit is over and done? I think you're gonna find yourself one smiling motherfucker.
And finally, in Pulp Fiction, we even have the characters in there acknowledging the performative aspect of themselves. So before Jules and Vincent go in to speak to Brett and the boys about the briefcase, they say,
"Come on, let's get into character."
And obviously this could be the actors as much as the gangsters saying this. This idea of needing to get into character is something that actors need to do, just as these gangsters need to do in the films. And all of this is very self-reflexive. And I alluded to this slightly when I was mentioning the intertextuality, the idea of him referencing lots of films. But another thing that he does is he mixes up genres, and Pulp Fiction is ostensibly a crime film, that's its primary genre, but it does reference other genres and mixes other ones in there too. So we have film noir, which we can see in the Vincent Vega and Marcellus Wallace's wife story, and we've got Mia Wallace, who seems to be fulfilling this archetypal femme fatale role, which gets upended during that story. There's also moments of comedy.
Look, foot massages don't mean shit. Have you ever given a foot massage?
Don't be telling me about foot massages. I'm the foot fucking master.
You giving a lot of them?
Shit, yeah. Got my technique down and everything. I don't be tickling or nothing.
Would you give a guy a foot massage?
Fuck you.
There's the spaghetti western allusion at the end of the film with the Mexican standoff, something that he did before in Reservoir Dogs. And one of the scenes which really kind of encapsulates this very well, and lots of people have said this isn't my idea, but when Butch is picking out a weapon to go downstairs to fight Maynard and Zed, it's almost as if he's going through genres. So we see a chainsaw, which relates to horror films, we see other props which might relate to grindhouse movies, until he eventually goes for the samurai sword, which of course we would associate with kung fu films or martial arts movies.
I mean, in the case of like Pulp Fiction, I think like the two biggest descendants that the film has are like
where did Pulp Fiction come from?
Yeah, well, it's like to me, when I look at it and I watch it, to me I kind of see like, you know, those like when like the French New Wave would do their version of crime films, when Jean-Luc Godard and Truffaut, and then like Jean-Pierre Melville before them would do their kind of like crazy French version of American movies. And then I also see like a kind of like a modern day spaghetti western playing there, as well as a blaxploitation movie from the 70s, all kind of like mixed up together.
And I think there's a couple of reasons for this. So firstly, as I said, Tarantino is a massive cinephile. He's seen lots and lots of movies, so he has a very good awareness of genre. He's an expert in genre. And I think lots of auteurs, lots of sort of serious filmmakers, if you like, have a bit of a snobbery towards genre and a reluctance to identify themselves as genre filmmakers, but not so with Quentin Tarantino. He is very proudly a genre filmmaker, and this ties in nicely to Sarris's third criteria of the auteur theory, where he says about the tension between the director's personality and the medium. And Tarantino himself has said, I work within genre, but I find a way to get my personality into that genre, and that is entirely Sarris's ultimate criteria of being an auteur. And I think it's also due to his love of Howard Hawks, one of his favourite directors. And if you look at Howard Hawks, he was a classical Hollywood filmmaker, and he worked in lots of different genres. So, you know, he did screwball comedies, he did westerns. Rio Bravo is one of Quentin Tarantino's favourite films, and many other genres as well.
Scarface.
We're just two little girls from Little Rock.
Every clue told me a different story, but each had the same ending. Murder.
And because of that, I think Quentin Tarantino wants to be like Howard Hawks, and he does sometimes combine several genres in one film. But also, if you look at his filmography, he is quite a varied filmmaker in terms of the genres he worked in. Kill Bill, which is a revenge martial arts film. Django, which is a Western film with elements of the slavery picture as well. So this is something that Tarantino isn't afraid to do, and he does that in his films a lot, and he does it in Pulp Fiction. And because he's such an expert in genre, that allows him to subvert genre expectations. So as I said, Reservoir Dogs is a heist movie where you don't see the heist. And in Pulp Fiction, we see the genre being subverted quite a lot. So we have these criminals, these gangsters, but he spends a lot of time humanising them and getting them to talk about very kind of uncriminal gangstery things like royales with cheeses and about foot massages and so on and so forth. We've got Mia Wallace, who looks like she's going to be a femme fatale character, but actually she's not, and she ends up getting saved by Vincent Vega. And at the end of the film, when we see Jules and Vincent going to leave the diner, I think that is very much a nod to Western films. So at the end of the shootout, you've got the two gunslinging heroes, and they tuck their guns into their holsters and they walk off into the sunset together, or they ride off on their horses. And Tarantino is playing with that genre idea, that genre narrative resolution at the end of Pulp Fiction, but instead of them being two cowboys, they're gangsters. Instead of them wearing cowboy hats, cowboy boots, they're wearing Bermuda shorts and t-shirts, and they're just walking out of a diner rather than riding away on horses. So he's using these genre expectations, subverting them and playing with them, and that is also postmodern. Playfulness, satirising something is something we would expect a postmodern film to do. As somebody who grew up in the 60s and 70s and I think has quite a sort of a retro aesthetic and nostalgia across his films, Pulp Fiction is a very ahistorical film, and fragmenting time is something that we see in lots of postmodern films, and we see in Quentin Tarantino's movies. And he's made a couple of period films, Django Unchained and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood and The Hateful Eight, but what he does very often through his use of soundtrack, by using more modern songs or songs from the 50s or the 60s and 70s and putting them in these period films. And it really kind of helps to show this idea that times, periods are clashing and coming together all at once, and it makes his films feel quite ahistorical. And we really do see this in Pulp Fiction. So a lot of the characters, you've got Mia Wallace, who looks like she could be something in terms of her costume out of a 60s New Wave film. Vincent looks more like a 50s character with his bolo tie and his love of Elvis.
An Elvis man should love it.
Jules looks like something out of a 70s blaxploitation movie. There are also elements of film form, so for example the rear projection, or we're used to seeing that in classical Hollywood films from the 50s and also French New Wave films from the 60s. And of course we've got the music, there's 50s, there's 60s, there's 70s, all the way up to the 90s that are all being used in there. And nowhere do we see this more than in Jack Rabbit Slims, where we've got these two people, one looking like they're from the 60s, one looking like they're from the 50s, but they're in the 90s and they're in this themed restaurant with all of these 50s icons around them. And so time periods seem to be sort of all colliding in at this one moment in this restaurant. And that's, you know, fine. That's all part of Tarantino's retro, ahistorical, nostalgic aesthetic. And I mentioned when he was growing up, Quentin Tarantino was immersed in black culture and loved blaxploitation films, spent a lot of time hanging out with black men. A lot of his friends, I think, growing up would have been black, and also listening to lots of music by black artists. And we can see his interest in black culture in Pulp Fiction and across his work. So firstly, it's the casting choices that he makes. So in Pulp Fiction, one of the lead actors in the film, Samuel L. Jackson, is a black actor, and he's cast black actors in the lead roles in a number of his movies, including Django Unchained and Jackie Brown. But also we've got Ving Rhames playing Marcellus Wallace in Pulp Fiction, arguably the most powerful character in the whole movie, being played by a black actor. And another common feature about these black characters in Quentin Tarantino's films is we see them getting revenge against white racist characters from the South, the oppressors of black people. And that is obviously most notably dealt with in the film Django Unchained. But it is in Pulp Fiction. So the characters of Zed and Maynard are both white characters, but their accents clearly tell us they are from the South.
Can I help you with something? Hey, you just wait a goddamn minute now.
In one point, Zed even uses the N-word when he's deciding which of the characters to take into the room so that they can rape him.
Amy.
Take your foot off the nigger, put your hand behind your head.
But just like in Django Unchained, these white racist southern characters do get their comeuppance at the hands of a black character. So initially we have Butch obviously come down and he's the one who kills Maynard, but it's Marcellus that uses the shotgun to blow off Zed's genitals, and then it's Marcellus who is going to be staying there to torture Zed, and he discusses that in very graphic detail.
I'ma call a couple of hard pipe-hitting niggas to go to work on the homes here with a pair of pliers and a blowtorch. You hear me talking, hillbilly boy? I ain't through with you by damn sight. I'ma get medieval on your ass.
And I think this is partly inspired by Quentin Tarantino's time in Knoxville, Tennessee, hanging out with those white kids who he described as being racist. And it's certainly a trend, and I'll discuss this in relation to women in a moment, but it's certainly a trend in his film where he sides with the oppressed characters and he has them get very gruesome revenge against the oppressors. And in the case of Django Unchained we see it, but also obviously here in Pulp Fiction we see Marcellus getting his revenge against the white oppressors and rapists. And whilst the issue of race is quite a contentious one for Quentin Tarantino as a filmmaker and for Pulp Fiction, he has come out in support recently of the Black Lives Matter movement, and he himself, I think, certainly sees himself as being on the side of the oppressed and on the side of African Americans. But it isn't just a case of him showing black characters getting revenge against white characters. He does show white characters and black characters getting on. Obviously, most notably, we've got Jules and Vincent, who we meet them straight away, and they are shot in a two-shot. There's a sense of equality there between the two, and they seem to be getting on. They seem to be very, very friendly. And even the character of Marcellus and Butch and their relationship is not one that we would describe as friendly. But Butch and Marcellus do come together to fight against Maynard and Zed. Butch could have left Marcellus there to his fate with these two characters, but he doesn't. He goes down and he defeats them and helps Marcellus out.
Yeah, I've grasped that, Jules. All I'm doing is contemplating the ifs.
And again, we see black and white characters being friends, even in Django Unchained, with the character of Dr. Schultz, played by Christoph Waltz, being friends with Django, played by Jamie Foxx. And similarly, in Jackie Brown, we see Pam Grier in a sort of semi-romantic relationship with the white actor Robert Foster. But it isn't just in the casting and the characters in his films where we see black culture being represented, but also in the soundtrack as well. Quite a lot of his films will feature music by black artists on the soundtrack, and that's true in Pulp Fiction. We've got Chuck Berry singing Goes to Show You Never Can Tell. We also have Reverend Al Green's song Let's Stay Together playing when Marcellus and Butch are talking in the bar. I did mention though that race is a contentious issue for Quentin Tarantino as an auteur, and that is due to the use of the N-word, which he uses frequently in his films and he uses frequently in Pulp Fiction. And it's used by black characters and used by white characters in the film. Notably, it's used by Jimmy, who's played by Quentin Tarantino, and of all the white characters in the film to use the N-word, Jimmy is the white character that uses it the most, and actually he's on screen for a very short time. So that makes it even more shocking, I think. And in terms of why Quentin Tarantino uses the N-word, he has defended it by saying that it would be inauthentic or dishonest to not do that. He thinks that these characters would use that word in real life.
If they feel in their heart of hearts that I'm coming from a racist place, all right, well then that's the question. Okay, that's where they're coming from, all right?
Right.
If that's not the case, then it's simply about me being a writer.
Right.
All right. And then they cannot say, I can't write another character. They can't say, I can't write black characters. I can't live my black characters. I can't be my black characters. I can't be my Filipino characters.
Right.
I can
You
be
can't
my
write
characters.
women in that case.
Right.
Exactly. But the thing about it is, as a writer, I am God as a writer.
Right.
And all these characters are mine and they're me, and I'm telling the truth. There's a hell of a lot of black guys in Compton say nigger all the damn time.
Right, so you
I
put
always said nigger was almost dead until rap brought it back.
Yeah, in Carson, in Inglewood, that's where I'm from. That not everybody, but there's a hell of a lot of guys where
and
that's
you're
their
and
thing.
you're reflecting that in your characters.
There's a segment of blacks in America that say that word constantly and use it as, use it in a zillion different ways, all right? And it has many, many different connotations. That's not a state of mind what I'm talking about. That's not theoretical. There are guys out there that talk exactly like that.
But not everybody agrees with him, and a lot of people have criticised him for the use of the N-word in his script. The most notable probably example of that would be the director Spike Lee, who's on a number of occasions criticised Quentin Tarantino for his excessive use of that particular racial slur. And so continuing on with the theme of Quentin Tarantino's casting of black actors in lead roles, that is actually quite unusual for Hollywood films. I think things are changing, but certainly in the 90s, if you look at the big films that were coming out in the 90s, like Speed or Ace Ventura or Forrest Gump, very often you would have a white actor in the lead role. But not only would they be white, they would very often be male. And Tarantino, again, is seen as a bit of a feminist filmmaker and very often casts women in the lead roles in his movies, in Jackie Brown and in Kill Bill, or if they're not the lead, they'll certainly have quite a lot of screen time. And Pulp Fiction is a film that passes the Bechdel test, for example, and if you look at the poster for Pulp Fiction, it's Mia Wallace on the front, and it's definitely marketed as a four-hander film. So the leads of the movie and the way that it was marketed were Uma Thurman, John Travolta, Samuel L. Jackson and Bruce Willis. So there's a lot of inclusivity and diversity in terms of the casting in terms of the lead roles in Pulp Fiction and across Quentin Tarantino's films. I mentioned that Tarantino saw his mother as a very strong, powerful woman, and I think that would account for why the women in his films are very often strong and powerful, particularly Jackie Brown and Kill Bill. And I think that Pulp Fiction perhaps isn't quite as feminist in its representation of women or quite as empowering in terms of the female characters as maybe some other Quentin Tarantino films. But there is actually quite a lot to recommend in the film in terms of its depiction of women and the central role that they occupy in the narrative. So if we consider the way that the women are costumed in the film and in terms of their physical appearance, I don't think you can say that they are being objectified, at least not in the traditional sense of the word. And so when we meet the female characters in the film, they're not very often wearing revealing clothing, they're not being made up and styled for erotic contemplation, as Laura Mulvey would say. And they're very often quite powerful characters. So Honey Bunny is arguably, the more aggressive and violent of the two characters. She's quite interesting. Sometimes she can be really sweet and tender. Other times she can seem quite psychotic. Fabienne, who stands up to Butch when he calls her a retard.
Shut up, fuckhead. I hate that mongoloid voice.
Mia Wallace, of course, who I think Vincent is quite frankly afraid of. And when she's introduced, she's a very powerful figure. We don't actually see her, which lends her this aura of power. We only see parts of her, so there's the extreme close-up on her lips. Obviously, her voice speaks over the speaker system, which gives her a sort of a godlike authority, and she tells Vincent what to do, go stand over there and make yourself a drink, and he does as he is told. And as I say, the female characters aren't objectified in the traditional sense of the word, and in fact, one of the sex scenes in the film might be the only sex scene in the film between Butch and Fabienne. It stays in a close-up on her face, and that scene is all about her pleasure rather than the man's pleasure. And that, I think, is probably quite unusual for a male filmmaker to do. If anything, you could argue that the one character that is objectified and fetishized in the movie, and that would probably be Butch when he gets out of the shower in the film. But I don't think it's all positive. So whilst Mia starts out as a very powerful character at the beginning of the scene, we have to remember that some of that power comes from the man that she's married to. I think part of Vincent's fear around Mia Wallace is due to the fact that she's married to Marcellus Wallace rather than the character herself. But as the film goes on, obviously she does overdose, and it is down to a man to save her life. It's not the other way around. Vincent does an overdose and Mia saves his life. So there is definitely, I think, a shift in power there. Fabienne at one point looks very scared and terrified of Butch when he loses his temper. And similarly, Honey Bunny, who starts out as this quite strong and powerful character, at the end scene of the film, Jules is the one who's in charge. It's a man that's in charge, and she turns into this sort of childlike figure, and she even says at one point,
I gotta go pee. I'm gonna go home.
In the same way that you would expect a small child to say. Now, I did say that he doesn't objectify women in his films. We don't really see a male gaze being used, and I think that's unsurprising. He's got a lot of respect and admiration for women. We know that he admired his mum, but also he worked at one point, he worked at an adult movie theatre, I think it was called the Pussycat Theatre, where they would be showing pornographic films, and he's said on a couple of occasions he has no interest in watching those films at all.
All right, so I was an usher at this porno movie theater at 16, lied about my age. And the irony of all ironies is when I was growing up, I always thought, man, forget about being a director, forget about being an actor.
Yeah.
To me, the greatest job a person could ever have would being an usher at a movie theater. Right. You know, you get to go to a movie theater all day long, and then you get to see all the movies for free. All right, well, irony of ironies, I ended up getting a job at a movie theater that I could care less about the movies and was totally bored by them.
Yeah. However, whilst he might not be objectifying them in the sort of traditional or the more common conventional way that women often are in Hollywood films, he does objectify one particular part of their body, and that is their feet. So I think it's fairly common knowledge at this stage that Quentin Tarantino has a foot fetish. And he doesn't try to hide that. If you watch any of his films, at some point you will inevitably see a close-up of a woman's feet. Pulp Fiction, we see Mia Wallace's feet. Before we actually see her face, he shows us a shot of her feet. We also see Esmeralda's feet as she puts down the accelerator pedal in the taxi cab. So yeah, he doesn't do it in the conventional way. There is still some objectification of women in his films. I'm going to point out something else which I think is noticeable or a bit of a trend across his films, and I would say that there is a homophobic representation of gay men in a number of his films. So it's slightly alluded to in Reservoir Dogs in a scene between Mr. Blonde and Nice Guy Eddie, where they discuss prison rape, and it's used in a very sort of derogatory way.
The guy got me on the ground, he tried to fuck me.
You wish.
You sick bastard, Vic, you tried to fuck me in my father's office. Look, Vic, whatever you want to do in the privacy of your own home, go to it. But don't try to fuck me. I mean, I don't think you're that way. I like you a lot, buddy, but I don't think you're that way.
Listen, if I was a butt cowboy, I wouldn't even throw you to the posse.
No, you wouldn't. You keep me for yourself. You know, 4 years fucking punks up the ass, you appreciate a piece of prime rib when you see it.
It might break you in, nice guy, but it'd make you my dog's bitch.
Ain't that a sad sight, Daddy? Man walks into prison, a white man walks out talking like a fucking nigger. You know what? I think it's all that black semen been pumped up your ass so far, now it's backed into your fucking brain, it's coming out your mouth.
It's also discussed in the film Hateful Eight, where the Samuel L. Jackson character talks about forcing somebody's son to perform oral sex on him, and it's done in a way that is meant to degrade the son and to kind of embarrass the father.
I pulled my big black pecker out my pants, and I made him crawl through the snow on all fours over to it. Then I grabbed me a handful of that black hair at the back of his head, and I stuck my big black Johnson right down his goddamn throat. And it was full of blood, so it was warm. Oh, you bet your sweet ass it was warm. And Chester Charles Smithers sucked on that warm black dingus for long as he could. Whoa! You're starting to see pictures, ain't you?
And I think it is worth pointing out that the only gay characters that we meet in Pulp Fiction are rapists, and that's not a positive representation of gay men in any way, shape or form.
Fabian says, I was a gay teenager in the 90s. This was basically the first depiction of gay sex in cinema for me and my classmates, and it taught them that gay men were pervert rapists with gimps who deserved to get killed.
And that isn't something really that I think Tarantino is often pulled up on, and it's not something that he's really addressed maybe, or if you feel differently, feel free to say something in the comments. But yeah, that is a troubling aspect of his filmography. Not something that many people would say he's well known for, but it is something that that I think you could say is there. Okay, that's the end of part 2 of my video on Pulp Fiction and the auteur theory. The link to part 3 is in the description below.
Get down.